Okay, okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished representative of the director, executive director of the Fondazione Eni Enrico Mattei, dear professors, ladies and gentlemen. It is for me a great honor and pleasure to open this conference, organized thanks to collaboration between the Eni Enrico Mattei Foundation, whom I thank for hosting us tonight, and the French Embassy in Italy. The theme of this conference, agriculture, food and climate change, is directly related to the two major events of the current year, Expo 2015 and the Paris Conference on Climate Change. France's participation in Expo Milano is made clear by its pavilion and by the rich program of scientific and cultural events organized together with the other French institutions abroad. By choosing the theme, Feeding the Planet, Energy for Life, organizers have chosen to raise the question of how to ensure the entire population of the world a safe and healthy food of diverse and good quality under economic conditions acceptable for all while protecting the environment. France had to be present and to offer concrete answers to various situations. To feed all the individuals who will inhabit the planet in 2050, nearly 10 billion people, of which approximately 70% urban, indeed requires to rethink the organization of all the links in the food chain from field to fork, but also to question the economic, social and environmental sustainability of food models. The red thread of the French presence is based on the premise that this challenge can be met by mobilizing at all levels all the resources at our disposal, particularly those produced by research in scientific and technical fields. This attention to the role of science and innovation goes hand in hand with a strong affirmation of the necessary promotion of ways of production and consumption that will be respectful of environmental conservation and of economic and social balance. Finally, the demonstration will also be made that technology and innovation are not conflicting with the production of quality food, nor with the preservation of taste and traditions. But 2015 is also the year of the COP21, the United Nations World Conference on Climate Change, to be held in Paris at the end of this year. This Paris conference is a crucial event whose purpose is to address climate change and to enable, first, to contain global warming below 2 degrees, beyond which level the impacts of climate change will be irreversible. Secondly, to adapt our societies to the disorders already visible and to promote low carbon development. The success of the Paris Conference, and more broadly the transformation of our development model, requires everyone's mobilization. States are no longer the only driving forces in today's world. Citizens and companies have become increasing sources of concrete solutions to climate change. That is why the Paris Conference aims at promoting not only a diplomatic agreement, but also a global alliance for the climate, which implies a mobilization of public and private stakeholders. In order to mobilize citizens, a rich and good information is needed, hence the importance of tonight's conference and of many other events organized in France and abroad by our diplomatic network. Be sure that France is fully committed in order to reach these objectives in Paris at the end of the year. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me welcome all of you, and in particular, let me welcome Monsieur Olivier Brochet, who is the Consul Général de France ici here in Milan. And when a few months ago from the French embassy, we got the proposal to organize together this event, we quite happily, enthusiastically accept the proposal for some reasons, a few reasons that in part coincide with what Mr. Brochet just told us about the importance of this year, not just for the Expo in Milan, but above all for the COP21 conference in Paris, in which important decisions will be taken about the future of our socio-economic systems. Certainly not about the future of the planet, but certainly about the future of our societies. And but most importantly, we decided to accept this proposal. And when I say we, not just me, but also Sabina Ratti, who is FEEM director. She cannot be here today. She apologizes. She's in Rome, and because of the problems with the airport, I mean the fire in the airport, some planes have been cancelled even today, so she could not be here today. But she certainly would have said the same thing. She really welcomed this event because it's really consistent with what FEEM has been doing for many years. I mean, studying impacts of climate change, and in particular impacts of climate change on agriculture, forestry, and other sectors which are crucial to food, for food availability, food production, nutrition of the planet. And in particular this year, we decided to focus many activities, many of our research activities, even disseminations and meetings and conferences on agriculture and water on agriculture, because there are many issues that could be dealt with when talking about climate change and agriculture, and we decided to focus on water, in particular water availability. We had a conference a few weeks ago, chaired, by the way, by another French, Michel Camdessus, the former president of the International Monetary Fund. He is also the president of our scientific advisory board, so we have another important French connection. And he chaired this session on water availability for food production around the world, in particular in Africa. That was quite an important event. And since then, we organized a series of webinars to promote and disseminate knowledge and understanding of the main issues concerning food production, and in particular water availability. We had some additional webinars upcoming in the next weeks until August, and then in August here in Milan there will be the World Congress of the Association of Agricultural Economists, and I think a large number, again about 2,000 economists, agricultural economists, will gather here in Milan at the University Statale to talk about these issues from an economic viewpoint, because of course we can talk about this issue from several viewpoints, and FEEM is also the center of this kind of interdisciplinary effort to deal with climate change, and in particular the collaboration that we established through the CMCC, the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, is really focusing on many different teams working together in order to produce new research and new modeling efforts, new tools to understand how climate change impacts on agriculture, food availability, food security, and so on and so forth. So it's really important for us to organize this meeting today, consistently with what has been done in terms of research, in terms of impact through Expo 2015, and in terms of preparation of the COP21 conference. By the way, talking about preparation, there is another important event in Paris in July, this Our Common Future conference, where science will gather. In December, there will be policy, in particular representatives of governments of all UN countries that will gather to take decisions, but science will meet in July, and it will be quite important because all scientists, not just climatologists, but all scientists, and in particular those dealing with water and agriculture and land use, will gather to talk about impacts of climate change and solution to deal with impacts of climate change. It will be a very important scientific event preceding the COP21 conference and providing the information, the scientific information that policymakers need when they will then meet in December in order to take the relevant decisions. So it's an important year for climate change, no doubt. It's quite an important year. There are many events, without mentioning, if I may, the July event in Addis Abeba. It will be the third major UN conference, the July one in Addis Abeba, the September one in New York, and finally the Paris in December. And this conference in Addis Abeba will focus on financing the measure to guarantee a better agriculture, a better sustainable development, in particular in developing countries. So it will be a sequence of identify financial tools, identifying the objectives, the target, the sustainable development goals, and then in Paris at the end, identifying the policies that will implement the important decisions that will be taken by governments all over the world. So again, this is the picture. This is the framework. As I said, it's important not just to focus on research and studies. Today we will talk about knowledge production, but it's also important to talk about solutions. And that's why this year we launched a new contest within the best climate practice work that we are doing on identifying solutions for climate change. This year, we focus on water security and solutions to provide water for agriculture productions all over the world. So the title of the contest is Climate Change and Water Availability for Food Production, as you can see over there. And it's an international contest for good ideas, best practices coming from all over the world that will provide new technological but also organizational, societal solutions to deal with the problem of climate change and water availability. So again, many ideas on the plate, many solutions, many proposals. Today, I believe that we will have the chance to listen to two of the best scientists, at least two of the best scientists in Europe, focusing on climate change and agriculture. And I'm very honored to have here both Jean-François Soussanat and Riccardo Valentini. Jean-François Soussanat is the director of the Environment Division at INRA, the Institut National pour la Recherche Agronomique in Paris. And Riccardo Valentini is professor at the University of Tucson and one of the founders of the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change and member of the strategic board of the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. Both have a sort of parallel scientific career because they've been very successful in terms of scientific production. They've both been lead authors of the IPCC since the 90s, since the beginning. They've been lead authors of Volume 2 for the second, third, fourth, and fifth assessment report. They've been contributing not just to the work of the IPCC, but of other important international and national organizations. And I believe that if we want to get good information, good science on the topic of climate change agriculture, they are certainly the best names that we could identify. And again, this is probably another nice output of this kind of collaboration between the French embassies and the FEEM, because luckily France and Italy have two of the best scientists in Europe working on climate change in agriculture. So I'm quite happy to have you both here, and I welcome both of you, and please come to this table. Thank you. Riccardo, if I may, I would like to give the floor to Jean-François first. Sure. And do you need a... Yeah, okay, fine.
For your invitation. I'm honored to be with you today, and I'm privileged also to explain what are the findings of IPCC concerning agriculture, climate change, and food security. And this work has been really achieved together with Riccardo Valentini, so it's also a good sign to be together to explain it again to this audience. Let me start by addressing the risks from increased climate change. For the first time, IPCC, in its 5th assessment report, has shown some negative impacts on crop yields of past climate change. That is, the changes since the 1980s in temperature and precipitation conditions have triggered a negative impact on the yields of wheat first, and that is shown here. It is -2% per decade, and also significant negative impact on the yields of corn, -1% per decade. However, the impacts were not significant for 2 other major crop species, which are rice and soybean. You can see that we have more documentation on what happens in the temperate regions, so we do find a negative impact here. There is a lot of variability in tropical regions, and the documentation is not as good, so there is no significant result. What is important is also the links with markets and food security. And this graph has been pictured in the IPCC report. It is well known, it has been quite extensively debated, because it shows the variability in food prices, volatility in prices, compared to some of the climatic events which happened. And although there are many aspects in food prices which pertain to stocks, pertain to the way the financial tools are working, and also to the price of energy, there is some evidence that at least some of the main climatic events happen to act on the food prices. For instance, there was a severe drought in Australia that stopped exports at that time, and this one in 2007, shortly after the prices raised. And again, in 2010 in Russia, there was an extreme heat event, +10 degrees Celsius in Moscow, very large smokes with the fires, and this led to a ban of exports by Russia. And other countries, fearing that they would not be able to support food for everybody, also banned exports. So although there are many other aspects in the controls of food prices and markets, it is believed usually that those climate events acted as a signal to change the prices and hence to change food security. For the future, what is foreseen according to a range of models, which are actually local models that work in different world regions, so regions where you have rather cool climates or warm and arid climates, is that by 2030, we would see a balance, a mixed bag for the effects. We would have, on the one hand, negative impacts, and they are shown here in the hot colors, in the warm colors, and we would have also some positive impacts, which are shown in the cold colors. However, by the end of the century, in the last decade of the century, 80% of the models predict that there would be negative impacts, some being quite severe, because we would have 40% of the model projections showing that there would be a reduction in yield, or at least negative impacts in yields, by -25% or more. What about Europe then? In our chapter, together with Riccardo and with some of the climatologists like Daniela Jacob, we were able to plot the changes in extreme events by the end of the century. And this is based on an ensemble of climate models, and it shows what would happen first in terms of the frequency of the heat waves. So if you take a rather mild climate scenario, with it is, let's say, sort of business as usual climate scenario, RCP 4.5 indicating a warming by 4.5 watt per meter square in the future by the end of the century. And if you compare it to this scenario, which is more severe, you see that in both cases there would be an increase in the frequency of heat waves. However, limiting climate change to RCP 4.5 would actually reduce the extent of the heat waves, whereas with 8.5 we would have a large extent of those heat waves. Then the heavy precipitation would also increase in frequency and severity, and this is shown, and it affects almost all regions in Europe, although Central Europe is quite hard hit under both scenarios. The increase of droughts would be very significant and actually would affect the Mediterranean basin. You can see that in both scenarios we have, in the warm colors, an increased duration of the droughts, and those would affect especially summers, but also springs. And Italy, France are certainly a part of the countries which would have problems with those droughts. Then there are some attempts to project the climate change impacts on wheat yields, for instance, one of the major crops for Europe, by the 2030. I selected that picture because 2030 is just within 15 years. It's just something which we see coming very quickly. And just look at those maps contrasting two climate models. You can see that in both climate models there are some severe reductions in wheat yields which are projected in some regions. However, because the distribution of rainfall across the climate models is not the same, the regional impacts would not be the same. For instance, here with that model, ECAM, it would be mostly Central Europe, Spain, and here you have also the British Isles, quite a lot of Western Europe being affected. However, we have adaptation as a key potential, and with adaptation we can change sowing dates, we can also change the cultivars. So for instance, you may want to have a different variety which can grow earlier and therefore escape the droughts. And you see that it is striking really that by the 2030s, agricultural adaptation may offset largely the negative impacts and even create some positive impacts. However, remember, this is only within 15 years. By the end of the century, the way to adapt would be more difficult to find and would imply in some cases some shifts in crop species, some changes in agricultural systems, or even some relocation of the agriculture in some regions. Another aspect, and this was introduced before, is obviously the linkage with the water supply. And a key limitation for agriculture is obviously under climate change, how much water can you use? We know the water demand will rise. We know that this will constrain also the possibility for irrigation. And you can see here that with a number of major crops, the changes in neat irrigation requirements are very large. There is a large increase in irrigation requirements both with and without CO2 effect. This is a bit technical. What we mentioned here with the CO2 effect is that the rising atmospheric CO2 concentration allows an increased water use efficiency of crops and thereby reduces the use of water. So if there was a perfect role of CO2, we would have less demands for irrigation than without the CO2 effect. And we believe that the situation in real farms would be in between those two graphs. Now I would like to introduce the key challenge about reducing greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And you know livestock is severely implied in this. A novelty in the last IPCC report has been to consider the agriculture, forestry and land use sector as a single sector. And this is very consistent to the current views we have in Europe and elsewhere about bioeconomy. Bioeconomy is precisely the use of bio-based materials, bioenergy, and this can be use of biomass for food, but also for non-food uses. This graph points to you the fluxes of biomass starting from production on land, cropland, grazing lands, then forestry, and some of the unused or some of the natural systems. You can see those fluxes, and obviously they are very large from the croplands. Then they go, part of them, directly to food used by humans. But remember, a large part goes also to the livestock, both ruminants and monogastrics. And we know that ruminants, in addition, are using the grazing land. So they convert that herbage into a resource that can be used by humans for food. However, this comes with extra emissions of greenhouse gases like methane emissions. Then on the other hand, we have forestry use for bioenergy, for instance. And we can see that there is some degree of recycling as the waste and residues go back here and can be used, for instance, like manure fertilizing the croplands. So what is interesting in that graph is that it shows you a very integrated system, and we really think now about the land use sector as an integrated sector on which we need to act to produce some mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. So what happened with the agricultural emissions is very interesting, because in fact those emissions have been reduced. This is a single sector, agriculture, forestry and land use, for which since 2007 there has been a neat reduction in emissions. The share of the sector was in 2007 31% of the total anthropogenic emissions, and it is now considered to be 24%. So why did this happen? Well, it's mostly because the net emissions of CO2 fell due to decreasing deforestation and increased afforestation rates. So it is the forestry sector that allowed to have this gain in the agricultural, forestry, land use sector. Nevertheless, the agricultural emissions increased, and we can see here the distribution of those emissions. I will not have time to go into the details, but you can see that there are large emissions still from land use change and forestry, then large emissions from enteric fermentation by the herbivores. We have also some degree of emissions from the drained peats and the peat fires, so the organic soils needs to be protected. But we have also other emissions from manures, from synthetic fertilizer applied to soils, and from crop residues and so on. Then another positive message is that the emission intensity of the products is falling as agriculture and forestry become more efficient. Let's compare the emissions per unit product of red meat. This is cattle meat. In the 60s, it was about 7.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of product, and now it has declined. It is considered to be below 6 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per unit product. So why is this? Basically because the systems are more efficient. A key consideration here is how much energy is used by the animals for production compared to maintenance. If they use more energy for production and less for maintenance, then the efficiency will rise, and this is precisely what has happened. You can see the same trends for other products, and therefore there are some good news, in fact, in the sector that is becoming slightly more efficient. So what are the key mitigation options? They are on the supply side. You have livestock management, cropland management. A very interesting possibility, which is largely untapped still, is about integrated systems. You can think of agroforestry, you can think of integrating livestock and crops so that you recycle the manure and you get benefits from this. And you can also think about silvopastoralism, where the animals are grazing under the shade of trees. Something new also in the IPCC report. It's not bioenergy, which is already there, but it is important, but it is a demand side. For the first time, the report has dealt with the possibility of reducing emissions from the sector by reducing wastes and losses, by also improving the food chains and changing the diets. So the global economic mitigation potential in agriculture in 2050 is estimated to be up to 10.6 gigaton CO2 equivalents, and this is with an optimistic view that you would be able actually, for instance, to have carbon markets or to have subsidies up to $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. That would help in creating the changes in the sector. If you do not have this, the changes are far less limited in OECD regions, but also, for instance, in some of the other key regions like Latin America and Asia. Yet the other possibility is, as I mentioned, reducing food losses and wastes. Here there is a large uncertainty, but it could go up to 6 gigaton of CO2 equivalent per year. The changes in diets are here again very uncertain, up to 7.3 gigaton of CO2 equivalent per year. I should say that I think this area is still largely under-investigated, and we hardly really know what is the CO2 footprints of real diets. We have a lot in the literature about rather theoretical modeling on this, but we don't have real data, so it's still an area that we need to research more. And then obviously the forestry mitigation options are very important. We need to take into account many barriers which are not strictly, not for all of them, strictly economical. Some of them may link to the behaviors, and this was a study which was looking at the behavioral barriers in a number of regions, including Kenya. I will not have time to mention everything, but there were some here the positive values here indicates that the barriers are low, and you get high values when you turn to the red. So obviously in Africa the barriers are perceived to be higher than in Europe. But more importantly, you have here an analysis of the behavioral barriers in Kenya, and you can see that a lot is about the lack of knowledge. So we have a key mission here to inform the farmers and to certainly talk with the farmers about their understanding of what is climate change. There is obviously lack of concern. There is also that the responsibilities are so not to be from the farmers but from other people, and so on. So we need to think about that sector, and it links with the sustainable development in a very integrated way, having biodiversity, ecosystem services issues, livelihood equity, food and water security, together with land tenure and income, gradually more integrated. If I have a few minutes more, I'd like to introduce you to some of the socio-economic scenarios. These are the shared socio-economic pathways which are now used within the IPCC to try to understand where we might go in the future with those integrated systems, and especially with that sector. So with those scenarios, we contrast some very contrasted futures, really. One is sort of middle of the road. So this is just business as usual changes over time by the end of the century. Then you have a rather pessimistic vision of the future, where we would have increased inequality across regions, and we would have a very fragmented world where there would not be so much technology transfer, and the environmental problems would not really be dealt with. And a more optimistic vision of sustainability. This is just the opposite. You have a lot of technology transfer, you have a lot of changes for the environment, and there is less inequality across regions. So the world population contrasts, I will only talk about those three, but you can see there are some more scenarios. Let's just look at the global world population according to a modeled scenario. If we look at this fragmented world, we get a very large increase in population. I don't know if it's even possible, but it would go up to 13 billion. Whereas if we get a very technology-rich and also environmental friendly world, we have actually far less population by the end of the century, and the SSP2, which is middle of the road, is sort of in between with about 10 billion people by the end of the century. The gross domestic product per capita is higher in the environmental friendly world, also because there is possibly less population, and it is much lower in the fragmented world, and here again the business as usual or middle of the road scenario is just in between. Then we've been modeling with some colleagues at IASA especially and others the changes in crop yields. You see here the historical changes in crop yields, and here we have the changes in crop yields for the different scenarios. So we would get higher crop yields actually with sustainability scenario, lower crop yield with fragmentation, and here again middle of the road is in between. The diet preferences were also modeled to try to reflect on the changes in the preferences for red meat or for pork meat and so on, dairy, eggs. And you can see that when you assume that you have greater sustainability, which is this SSP1, you get, in most cases, you get then a reduction in the red meat. Whereas if you have the fragmented world, you have actually the preferences are still with red meat. What happens with livestock, and I'm taking livestock because it is a key sector for the greenhouse gas emissions, is that under business as usual scenarios, we have a large increase in demand by 2050, we have a rise in prices, and therefore the sector expands. It expands, creating more deforestation, more greenhouse gas emissions, and this is very clear in a number of regions, that's for the world, but this happens in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have increased deforestation from this expansion of the livestock systems in the tropical woodlands and ecosystems. So trying to recap from what we learned from those scenarios, with SSP2, the business as usual scenario, expansion of agriculture and grasslands by a large number of hectares, creating more deforestations and high emissions. SSP1, which is the climate-friendly world, we have technological changes, less livestock production, less demand for livestock, and this induces savings of up to 300 million hectares of forest and other natural land. In SSP3, we have this fragmented world, which is not very rich, so there is a slow productivity growth, and the same amount of land would be cultivated, but it would be less productive. And given land use change, the global animal numbers are not really affected across those scenarios. It is interesting to reflect on those scenarios because there are already studies which show that you can gain a lot by reducing deforestation. This is a work that we have achieved with some Brazilian colleagues, especially from Embrapa. It concerns the Cerrado. And you can see here that if you are able to supplement the cattle with concentrate and protein to achieve pasture restoration, you could really gain a lot. That's the graph is interrupted, but it is 27 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year that would actually be achieved through avoided deforestation. So there's a lot of potential in pasture intensification to save forests. It is interesting, and I will conclude on this issue, to see the role also of soils. With the European project, we've been serving a large number of farms in about 10 countries, and it was striking to see that the farmers were really concerned, first of all, by the soil management. You can see this in South America, you can see this in Africa. Their key concern is about soil degradation, really. Soils happen to contain 2 to 3 times more carbon than the atmosphere. So in theory, there is a large potential in restoring soils to capture carbon, sequester it in the soils biologically. We've been having this calculation, actually, that if you were able to have a 4 per meal per year restoring of the soil carbon, you would largely compensate the current rise in atmospheric CO2, and I'll go back to this. Because this is really something which has been stated by our Minister for Agriculture, Mr. Stéphane Le Foll, and by our ambassador for the climate negotiations, Laurence Tubiana, that we need to launch a research program on how to strengthen the current land carbon sink through large-scale biological soil carbon sequestration. This is a very ambitious target that they are setting for us, but here again, this is to be part of the agenda of solutions at the time of the COP21 negotiations. They would like us to study options to reinforce the current land sink, which you know reaches about 10 gigaton of CO2 equivalents per year, and to actually double it. This would then restore carbon in soils at a rate of about 4 per meal per year. And if we do so, we would need to store about 3 gigaton of carbon per year, and that's something where we know that agricultural land, including grasslands, can store up to 1.2 gigaton of carbon per year. And so we need to think about also the other lands, like the forests, which sort of combination, possibly also agroforestry, could help us reach this target. How could we restore degraded lands, also the organic soils, to help reach this target? I think the vision they have is that to increase the land carbon sink will greatly facilitate the options for the other sectors, but also for agriculture by gaining time, and also by providing increased soil fertility, increased resilience to drought, and therefore increased adaptation to climate change. So the last slide is to tell you about our efforts in France right now, because we are ahead of this major climate negotiation in Paris at the end of the year. And so we are organizing scientific conferences. There was one on climate smart agriculture, which took place in Montpellier. As already mentioned, the next big conference is our Common Future Under Climate Change, which will take place in July in Paris. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this excellent overview. Given the time constraint, I think that we could spend five minutes for quick questions, clarification questions, and leave the full discussion at the end. But if you want to raise some questions now and get a better understanding of what Professor Susanna just said, you can do it. For example, at the end you mentioned sequestration and CO2 removal, But in all IPC scenario, this is a crucial component of the trajectory to achieve the 2-degree target. Without CO2 removal, in at least at the end of the century, there's no way to stay beyond the 2-degree target. So, what's the role of agriculture? How much could it do? And in particular, how much land should be used to achieve the target? Because what you said is just a tiny fraction of what with respect to what should be done by the end of the century. And if land use is going to be excessive, we need to resort to other technologies. Agriculture will not be the solution.
Yes, thank you. Very clearly, agriculture cannot be the solution for, given the dimension of the problem, but it can obviously have a part in the solution. And I think that where we can see a complementarity is that we need to create also a lot of biomass for use by bioenergy. And many of the scenarios are now talking about BECCS, which is bioenergy, carbon capture and sequestration. So it's different from what I have been showing. It's really a technological process. You're going to burn your biomass, you're going to capture the CO2 and to store it in some ways. However, if we want to have this amount of biomass, we need to restore degraded ecosystems. We need to restore degraded land. So I think it would be highly complementary to think of starting by restoring the degraded lands, restoring the soils, increasing the soil organic matter fertility, therefore also having an extra capacity to reduce the impacts from climatic variability, to have the potential later in the century to create a massive effort in terms of bioenergy.
And what's the size of degraded land with respect to total land?
It's very much discussed. There are different ways to look at it, but the usual size is about 1/4 of the total land area. This is based on satellite measurements. If you base it on observations, you get different areas which are spotted, but the fraction is about the same.
Can be more if you include agricultural soils as degraded soil in terms of carbon. So all the agricultural soils are there is a carbon gap to fill. So that's, if you include it, maybe you can go up to 40%.
Is it mostly in developing countries?
Yes, it is, but even in Europe we have some soils certainly which are degraded, and this is a bit more in the Mediterranean area, but a bit more also in Central Europe. And to refer to exactly what Ricardo said, the carbon gap in our agricultural soils is substantial. So even in Europe there is a lot of potential to restore carbon in our soils.
Do you have in mind a redirection or a way of designing differently the common agricultural policy in Europe?
Well, so far, no. I think it will come in the discussion at some stage. It's a very important question, but I think we are just a bit too early in that debate to understand what could be the consequences.
Are there other questions? Please.
It's a question of ignorance. Why in a less sustainable world, the population is supposed to be more numerous than in a sustainable one?
Well, I think it has to do with poverty, really. What happens is that when you have a lot of poverty, you do not have the conditions for a transition in the demography. So you still have very large birth rates. So when you have a rather fragmented world with a lot of inequality, not a lot of technological transfer and so on, there is a lot of poverty. And hence, you do not have a rapid transition in demography in key areas like Africa and South Asia. Well, conversely, if you have just an environmental friendly world, and in that scenario, it's also a world where you have a lot of technology transfer. I think it's a world where you have also a lot of trade. You have a more balanced growth of all regions, less poverty, and hence faster demographical transition.
Other comments, questions? No. So let's move to Riccardo and then think about it, because you will have time at the end to raise questions for both speakers today. Riccardo.
Okay. I guess this is my here. Yes. Okay. And let's start here. Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for this kind of parallel bilateral meeting where, as Geoffroy said before, we'll be working together in IPCC, many European projects. That's quite nice for me to parallel his talk. Well, we will say probably some complementary things or sometimes similar thoughts. We try to mix up everything, and at the end you will have a picture of different reflections. My question here is whether feeding the planet, reducing global warming is compatible. So this seems to be two different things. How to feed the 7 billion, 9 billion people in the future, while at the same time reducing global warming through reducing agricultural emissions. And this is quite challenges. Challenges because, well, we as humans are dominating most of the land in the planet, and to feed our humans, we have indeed put a lot of pressure in our resources today. You see just this example of two panels showing in the first one is the air trajectories that are moving all around the world, and second panel is the Facebook contacts every day we have. So that's are the two measures of how humans are putting pressure on our resources. And of course, this is the classical graph where you see what we have in front of us, the population growth that is reaching 9 billion by 2050. What is more interesting, by the way, is the quality of the population growth. And what we learned that maybe was not so popular in the media is the fact that, for example, in 2010, about half of the people living the planet were urban and half rural. And in the future, we will be more urban people than rural people. So this is a big challenge. How we can feed 80% of the global population with only 20% of farmers living in the planet. That's something that implies for sure a big transformation in our agriculture. We need to possibly improve our technologies, improve our yields in a growing demand of land. The land is another limiting factor, so this is another constraint in our challenge of feeding the planet. You see, in the last maybe the last 2 centuries, we have done most of the land conversions. Before 2 centuries ago, the situation was quite stable in terms of land availability. Today, we are we have transformed about 40% of land or natural land into agriculture to feed humans, basically. And in terms of the implication in global carbon cycle, the emission associated with land transformation is quite significant, although slowly reducing in terms of deforestation. We have about 3.3 gigatons of CO2 emitted by tropical deforestation compared with the 32 of gigatons that are emitted by fossil fuel combustion. On the other hand, you see on this on the right side, on the left side. On the right side, you see that only 44% of the total CO2 is really going into the atmosphere, while about the rest, the half of the rest is divided by land sequestration, carbon sequestration by current vegetation, 29% of the emissions, and about 26% is stored into the ocean. So this is a great help for us. Without this, the situation would have been much worse than it is now. So we have a deforestation that is following the need of available land, and it's about 30 million hectares per year disappearing. Just to give you an idea, the Italian forest land is in the order of 10 million hectares. So we are more than the Italian forest total area is going to tropical deforestation every year. And the emissions associated with tropical deforestation are also quite important, although they are decreasing. Today we are about 1 gigaton of carbon, 3.3 gigaton CO2, and this is something that, of course, will be included, is included in the Paris Accord. It's called a RED Plus mechanism to reduce deforestation, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's an important measure of reducing greenhouse gas emissions globally. But coming to the agricultural sector, agricultural sector is still important. Still important is 26% if you include land conversion and direct agricultural emissions. And so this is also a focus where we can really today put some attention. Of course, as Jean-François said before, agriculture cannot save the world, in a sense, cannot really be the only sector that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, global warming. But I think today there is no really one energy technology that can really change the situation. So we have to work in a very, let's say, diverse approaches, so we can do what we can in different sectors, and so agriculture can do part of the business. And of course, one of the main point we face with our agriculture is that today, if we want to look at sustainability of our food production, our food chain, this is just an indicator of sustainability. Is the amount of energy we consume per unit of energy of food that we can get as metabolic energy. And this ratio was about 1, so it was very sustainable until the 70s. So it's only about 40 years ago that we use about 1 unit of energy to produce food and 1 unit of energy we could get for our metabolic life. Today, this ratio is about 100. So we put 100 energy to produce food than the energy we get. So it's something, it's energy including, for example, that we want to have food out of the season, use energy for greenhouse cultivations or water or oil and so on and so forth. So this is a big point to take into account for our future agriculture. And agriculture emissions are increasing. This is another point, increasing. Today they amount about 4.7 gigatons CO2 equivalent. It's compared quite striking with transport. It's 6.76. So it's agriculture and transport are quite comparable in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and of course primary energy production is 12.5. What we want to look at the greenhouse gas emissions included in all the agri-food chain. This is quite new, I would say, because I've never seen so many studies really analyzing the total of the agro-food sector. This is, for example, a study we made in Italy. Is a vertical reconstruction of the greenhouse gas emissions, and we arrived to, for example, this number that each Italian for food emit about 1.7 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So this is our burden in with our food every day. But what is interesting of this analysis is that still the most of the emissions are in the agricultural production, are at the farm level. And for example, we had this discussion about 0 kilometers, the transport, and so on. Yes, they are, important, but they are not so important. I mean, they are about 20 million tons of CO2 compared with the 47 of the agricultural production. So I don't want to reduce enthusiasm in the 0 kilometer food. I do appreciate that very much, but it's not the real problem for greenhouse gas emission, as well as, for example, industrial transformation. The industry is not so much contributed to greenhouse gas emissions. So still the farm level is is an important contribution to total emission. And most of one important gas that is related to, besides methane in livestock, is N2O emissions. And this is just recent analysis, global N2 emissions. And you see that there are many areas in the world where you have quite significant N2 emissions related to fertilizer use intensity of agriculture. And one thing, again, that is also emerging is important to probably very difficult to negotiate, I guess, in Paris, if agriculture is going to be really part of this discussion, is the role of emerging countries. And you see, this is a recent study showing that the N2 emissions associated with the industrialized or emergent countries, including China, is very much different. And the emerging countries play a fundamental role today about N2 emissions. And about 94%, okay, one could say, okay, all the N2 emissions that are produced in China, Brazil, and so forth, is because they export food to other countries or to industrialized countries. That's not true, because indeed our data showing that 94% of the N2 emissions are for domestic production, because the domestic demand is growing so fast that the most of almost total of the N2 emissions are inside the tropical and emerging countries. So this, what does it mean? That if we want to do something of really significant, we have to focus also in these countries. And I think it's not so easy to negotiate and to show this type of data in an international climate accord. But we have to. It's like for CO2 emission. I mean, this is another reality, that we have emerging countries also playing fundamental role in the agricultural sector as well. And of course, the other dimension of the question, if we have enough food, is climate change. As Geoffrey already pointed, that there are several studies showing decline in food production. These are the red areas in the world. But there are few regions where actually climate change will be an opportunity. We look at the border regions, for example, Russia, for example. Russia could become really an important food producer in the future, because they have a lot of abandoned land, and a lot of land will be available due to global warming. And okay, what will be the future in terms of increasing population and amount of food available? This is a study showing basically two scenarios for 2050. The first scenario showing that about between 2 and 5 billion of people will be undernutrition by 2050 due to climate change globally. And another scenario is showing that about 4 to 7 billion of people will be undernutrition. What is the difference between the two scenarios? The difference is if these people will eat meat or not. Basically, the second scenario, the worst one, is for a change in diet, a big change in diet, where most of the emerging countries are going to eat meat. And of course, this will amplify the climate change impacts on food production. And unfortunately, there is a quite strict relation between GDP and meat consumption. So we know that increasing GDP, of course, has a result increasing in the meat production, in meat consumption. But I want to point to another dimension on this question of food. What we can do really under current circumstances, under current agri-food system to help to really feed planet and reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Can we do something, maybe optimizing our system? And yeah, I think so, because there are some paradoxes that we could really address. The first one is about the question of nutrition. Are we sure that all the people are undernutrition? It's not so clear. There are also a lot of other people that are overnutritioned. These are the numbers. You can see that about 868 million people are undernutrition, undernourished. About 1.5 billion of people are overweight, are obese. And at the end of the story, almost the same population, 36 million or 29 million, are dying every year due to malnutrition or to vascular disease, diabetes is important disease of current society, tumors and so on. So again, can we do something? Can we redistribute the food in a way that this disequilibrium can be reduced? The second paradox to some extent is we have few land, we don't have much land, but we're thinking to use land in a probably different direction than direct food production. And for example, in the future, it's the grain production mostly will increase by 2.1%. Or 15% for non-food, let's say not direct food consumption, +2 probably for livestock feeding, so for feeding cows or animals in general, or 50% is forecast for producing biofuels. And for human consumption, actually there will be a decrease of grain availability. So that's something that we need to decide to some extent what will be the future direction of the limited land we have. Should we go for cows and cars? Should we go for maybe giving more direct food production? That's something that is needed to be considered. And the third one, I think is also quite relevant, is the food waste and food losses. We produce quite substantial food globally, but we waste about 1.3 billion of tons of food every year. And this is about 4 times the food that is needed for feeding the 860 million of people that is undernourished. Again, something that is a little bit strange or need to be addressed. Another dimension is not only food waste, but also food losses. That for me is actually very important. I think we have a big responsibility. It's about technology of post-harvest conservation of food. In most of tropical countries, food is lost from farm to the place where it is used. So you can imagine all these big cities that are growing in Africa or Southeast Asia. They don't get the food because in the middle, at the level of farm and beyond the farm, between the farm and the city, the food is lost. It's lost for about 35%. Again, this is a waste or loss of agriculture production. Can we do something for that? Yes, I think so. We can transform the food. We can provide technologies actually, Italy, France has been leading for centuries the small-scale food transformation. And because what we are thinking is not just, Nestlé or Ferrero going there. I just giving some names to create big plans for food transformation. We can really respect the cultural identities, the historical, let's say, behavior of this population. And that's possible to introduce an efficient way to preserve food, to transform the food in small scale and provide this food to where is needed. So again, this is an important element of what we can do to change our agri-food system. So basically the question is which is the direction we take, the big intense agriculture system versus the smart agriculture that we probably think is the more sustainable. And so I finish with a concept similar to what Jean-François said before. We've been always trying to separate agriculture from natural ecosystems, or for forests or natural ecosystem in general. And this was done in the Kyoto Protocol, where Kyoto Protocol is based on activities rather than on land. So the accounting is based on activities. We think that is the time now, and this is a plea for Paris, to introduce the land-based approach. So all the land has to be accounted, all together, putting together rural areas, forest areas, natural ecosystems, because all together they contribute to the atmospheric concentration signal. So the atmosphere doesn't distinguish between a land that is cultivated versus another that is not cultivated or is natural. So this is something that we can include, and this will help a lot. Will help a lot our farmers as well, I think, because this is just an example. It's a landscape approach. What does it mean? That we have agricultural areas, or we have small urban areas where you have emissions. Maybe you have I don't know, a cheese farm here with, again, emissions because they have livestock. You have roads with the cars, there's maybe emissions, but you have, I don't know, grasslands that are carbon storing, carbon sequestration elements, or you have forests here. So at the end, this community, this territory can be carbon neutral if they manage in equilibrium what are their emissions and their carbon sequestration. So I really would like to see in the next discussion the possibility to include land-based accounting because this will reinforce the concept of landscape. This will give farmers the possibility not to be considered as the criminal of greenhouse gas effect, but to take care also of the other elements of landscape. And so in this case, they can benefit from this. Yeah, okay, finally, I think we need a circular economy of food or bioeconomy, whatever, reduce waste and losses, redistribute access to food and nutrition, save the agricultural land. This is one statement I think is very important. Of course, there is a technological challenge. We can do it using different technologies to increase carbon, water, and nitrogen energy use efficiency. And I think also an agreement, a decisive agreement with land-based accounting could be helpful in this direction. In particular, I think also the Milano Charter, I want to mention it because in the Expo 2015 there will be a document. This will be approved by Ban Ki-moon, I hope, in October 16, if I remember. So just, before the COP. Okay, the current situation of the Charter is not particularly concrete in terms of objectives and targets, but contain quite a lot of elements that may also be helpful for the Paris Accord. Finally, I just want to mention that the waste in Europe, the food waste, could account for 5% of European greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not a small number. Thank you.
Thank you, Riccardo. Again, many issues to discuss. Other questions or comments, whatever? Please.
When we see the waste we are making with these thematics and the difficulty we have to solve this apparently easy problem, it is true that the problems related to climate change, which in my mind are much difficult to solve, I have the feeling that we can be a little bit pessimistic. What is your feeling about that?
So you mean comparing the waste measures versus other climate friendly? Well, I don't know. I try to be optimistic in a sense that the climate agreement is global climate agreement is quite difficult because it is sometimes really too high level from the citizens, from the real things. It's I don't want to be against the United Nations system. Yes, I think it's fine, but something like a food waste, something that it can be in the hands of people, can be in the hands of local authorities, local governments. So I'm thinking that also using some economic incentives, for example, to reduce waste or to tax waste in a way that tax food waste, something like this. maybe more concrete than achieving an international agreement on minus 40% or 50% emission reductions. That is quite, general, and people doesn't really see what does it mean. I don't know. It's just my point.
Maybe I can add a word here, which is that many of us in the scientific community think that it would be extremely useful to have consumption-based accounting of greenhouse gas emissions, because in fact, when you look at the production-based accounting, which is the one which is considered in the framework conventions for climate change, you just forget that what China is emitting, for instance, is largely for exports, and that we are consuming, for instance, in Europe, but also in US and elsewhere, a large part of that industrial production, and the same would go for agricultural products. So if you're able to, let's say, have a metric which is a bit more human-based, based on our own consumption, then you get to understand that meaning minus 40% at global scale is minus 40% for each of us. And that's something so important that we really need to think about it.
Please.
I have read, maybe in the New York Times or in any case in a respectable journal, that in order to feed the world, a second green revolution is needed. While, according to what you said, the production of food would be already vastly enough to feed the world, provided the food was not wasted. So, do we need a second green revolution or not?
This is the question of time. Currently, yes. With the current population, assuming that we don't waste food. Okay, that's just by magic. Tomorrow we don't waste any piece of food. We can have food for everybody. The question is on timing. So the projection. So because we grow every year. We grow quite fast, and so we don't know exactly. Even if we don't waste food, what will happen? Let's say after 2050. Let's put this as a limit of time. And of course, climate change is also part of the story. How much climate will reduce our production? So. Yeah, you're right. Today, I think we can solve the problem, but not maybe in the future. But I'm not sure.
But Riccardo, what you showed is that the yields increased 4 times in the last 50 years, from the 60s to now. 4 times increase in yields. Why not expecting such a similar increase in the future? Second, when you mention the energy increase per unit of food production, a lot of this increase is also the reason why we had this strong increase in yields. So it's not really bad, because more yields require more energy. So the solution could be energy. If we have the possibility to identify a source of energy which is not polluting, which is not impacting on climate, even the food problem could be solved, because we would solve the water problem, we could solve the energy content of food problem, and then the availability of food of everybody. So at the end of the story, we go back to the energy issue.
Well, yes. I was here about 2 hours ago in another meeting. We were talking about biostimulants and their role in sustainable agriculture. And you're right. Because nitrogen production today is very energy consuming. By chance, you see the growth on 2 emission is paralleling perfectly the CO2 by fossil fuel. This means that when we discover energy, cheap energy like oil, we are able to break the N2 molecule in the air and produce inorganic fertilizer. So, but we spend a lot of energy in doing that, and also we have the the N2 emissions from the soil. But for example, biostimulants, today we were discussing about this, can reduce, for example, by 50% of nitrous oxide emission, because they improve the nitrogen use efficiency of plants. So again, yes, we had to work on in technology, innovation. Biostimulants are completely organic, so they no pollute. So it's something that we probably can do something, but still we are in a phase of searching for, scouting of new ideas.
Yes, well, I think it's obviously the sort of key question that everybody has, which is how far can you go with the increase in yield? Currently, we are, and we have been with that trend for some decades, with actually a yield increase on average, which is about 1%, a bit more per year. But just remember that for some of the key crops, decade after decade, we have seen a slowdown in that yield increase. This is true for wheat. It is true for a few other major crop species. So this questions how far we can go with that yield increase, especially given the negative impacts from climate change. Then the second limit is obviously with the greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that in fact there is a transition period over which we can have the same model and we can still feed the world population with that, let's say, dominant agricultural model. But at some stage we will need some key changes. And those key changes we need to think. I fully agree with you about how would you convert agriculture to renewable energies in some sense. The example about nitrogen fertilizer is telling because there is clearly a very simple alternative, which is biological nitrogen fixation. And you don't need to have gene transfer for this, you just need to use legumes. Well, this is sort of low tech, but it can be also high tech if you think of how you're going to push this to a high production level. And what as in other sectors appears is that you need to rely more on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So I'm fully with Ricardo about what you said about the landscape-based accounting. And in some sense, a lot of the future of agriculture is really at the landscape scale, through increasing biodiversity and therefore enhancing rather than reducing, as we have done in the past, some of the key ecological services like pollination. And if we do so, it is likely we can produce more with less, to take this logo from FAO. And we could, in fact, probably get further into that transition.
From what you said, both of you said, there are many small, short-term steps that could be implemented quickly and be very effective. Why is it that this doesn't happen? What is the resistance in the agriculture sector?
I'm not an economist, but I suspect a lot has to do with economy, so this would be on your side to explain it. But my understanding is that, we did have a rapid growth, and the markets are expanding. Just we are discussing now about livestock, but just remember the livestock market is certainly one of the markets expanding most rapidly right now. So there is not really a signal that would create the changes. And one of the key questions is about how would the carbon funding come into place? How would the adaptation fund modify the current trends? If there is no economic signal, I suspect there is no key reason why we would change tracks for agriculture.
No, so go back to the policy issue at the end. And then, other questions? You may have some curiosity still. I mean, no, it's 8 o'clock. Yeah, we have 2 more minutes, so we want time for one more question.
You have never mentioned that this year is the year of soil. And you have been talking about soil a lot. And so I wonder why. It's something that it's just another piece of United Nations which is concerned about. It's FAO who is just pushing the year of soil. Just a curiosity.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid I just forgot to mention it, but clearly now in my mind this is important, and the soil issue is really a key issue for many dimensions, agricultural production, ecosystem services, but also, as we heard, mitigation, and there are a number of others, like water, for instance. So definitely we need to think about more integrated strategies to deal with land management and land restoration, and the soil year is a good occasion to tell this, so sorry for not mentioning it.
I may add something that maybe we really didn't talk about, but there's a climate, there is but soil itself is a constraint sometimes for plant production, and recently there's this new phenomena of soil exhaustion that was already studied in the past, but now it's becoming really very important, because there are many agricultural crops that now for many years has been used by pesticide and fertilizers, and this has to some extent destroy, at least this is the hypothesis, destroy the biodiversity of soil microorganisms. And the effect is it was called a soil exhaustion. So basically there is no other explanation than the fact that the plant is not able to grow in that soil because of lack of other organisms that are not there anymore. This has been shown in several papers now, and is an emerging problem for intensive agriculture. So even if you put fertilizer, they don't respond to what is this more or less some of this idea of stagnation of yields that could be also related to this soil exhaustion. And well, I think this is important also to consider. So thanks for your question.
Okay, please.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you, both of you, because it has been very instructive and very clear, and thank you very much for the non-specialist, and I am the opportunity to understand better the problems. I would like to know if you could develop a little bit your third point at the end, so on a decisive agreement in Paris. Could you precise what would be a decisive agreement for you in this field in Paris?
Well, this was referring to the agricultural sector, as of course we all want a decisive agreement in general global for reducing emissions. The point is in the Kyoto Protocol history, basically the approach we have used was this approach of activities in the land use change sector. So you have a managed forest, and these account for Kyoto. You have a natural forest. This is nothing to do with Kyoto accounting. So we have divided the land into a fragmented pieces where Kyoto apply and where Kyoto doesn't apply. And this is because we choose activities as the definition of Kyoto land. So Kyoto land is a land where you do forest management or where you do agricultural crop growing. But for example, if you have a wetland, now we have wetlands, natural wetlands, or you have a natural forest, or you have natural grasslands, these are not included. The proposal is, and actually many scientists, I have to say, even in the US, actually the US government position is much in this direction, really. Although, sorry to go into a bit into technicalities, but although at when the Kyoto Protocol was discussed, the US wanted to have land-based accounting for reducing emission, because if they include all the forest of all the nation into this accounting, they could achieve their targets very easy. At the time, of course, there was not this idea, and Europe was standing against, and after that, Bush government came into it, so U.S. gave back from Kyoto, and so on and so forth. But anyway, this is, I think, again, time to repropose this new accounting. As I say, it is very important, as also for just Francois presentation. It's very important to combine all the landscape together, because the agriculture is not just the crop, but is also taking care of the land, taking care of the land degradation, taking care of resources, natural resources. We have pollination problems. We need shelters. We need so this create, I think, a good argument for including this land-based accounting, and scientifically also more rigorous. So,
For sure. Rosa, what would you expect from the Paris Agreement for the agriculture sector?
Well, I think it's the first time that on the negotiation table we have a text that mentions food security. This was in Geneva. And it's a very important time for the agricultural sector, because finally, after so many years, it could be that the sector comes into the negotiations. And this was not the case. So I think the key issue is to have a better counting of the problems and solutions of the sector in the negotiation. And as we heard, it's something which is difficult, because we know there is a north-south divide about it. A number of countries, for instance India, but certainly African countries, are very concerned about any limitation to their possibility to grow more food over time because of climate negotiations. So we have to be very careful about anything that would constrain their ability to develop their agricultural production. On the other hand, there is a lot of concern, as we already expressed together, about this degradation of land and let's say the consequences for people. And if we take the positive view, which is that we can restore land and we can hence have benefits for many countries, I think we can create a very positive solution in that area. And it would be certainly compatible with this landscape accounting. I think the only problems that some countries have with landscape accounting is that some said it could create some hot air, meaning that you would not be able to really monitor, verify what's happening. So the challenge is also for us scientists, how can we create methodologies that can really be trusted by governments and can lead to something which is well accounted for.
Add something there, because I think it will be more convincing. The hot air question. I mean, okay, if we include let's say the natural carbon sequestration into emission targets, that could be thought as kind of hot air included in the. But for example, I think if we allow to compensate only the agricultural sector with the natural resources, this could be more easy to sell, because at that point we just give responsibility to the, let's say, landowners to compensate inside their sector without using the forest for compensating energy emissions. I think something we can think a little bit more on providing a way to make more easy to sell.